the title of this video, which we're working on before coming up, the polling paradox, that you believe that the outcome of the polls somehow showing that the war will continue. What is that? What is your understanding of it's not about the war in Ukraine. It's all on all fronts. It seems that the war will continue.
Yeah, let's do it this way. I promise that if you've tuned in, there are quite a few surprises here. And one of the reasons why we're on the podcast, in the podcast universe, are surprised is that politics isn't just about running out of military stocks, firing patriots, or penetrating the Israeli Iron Dome. No. What we've got to do here is quickly go through how the presidents of the US, presidential politics in the US, are run, and the surprises that we can now see from the polls as we approach election day. First, I'll do it in the US, then I'll do it in Russia, because we've got Russian polls that have just come in. Okay, let's run through quickly the surprises. Surprise number one, Marco Rubio is now running neck and neck with J.D. Vance, 39%, 38%, as the favored presidential candidate. Now, that's a very sharp increase. It's not yet showing in all the polls, but it's showing in a significant poll by the Emerson College. Okay, now what that means is that Rubio is running, from his point of view, a successful war against Cuba, first to destroy the Castro regime, to destroy the Castro family, and to destroy Cuba as it's been since Fidel's revolution. War is very good for Rubio, for Rubio's chances of becoming president in 2028. That's first surprise. Second surprise, Vance is now keeping the Trump succession candidate, Donald Jr., at bay. Vance, while he may be facing Rubio as a rival, has to face Donald Trump Sr. and Donald Trump Jr. as a succession problem. Now, right now, the average polling for presidential favorite for Vance is around 40%, 39 to 40%. Donald Trump Jr. is stuck at 10 to 12. Now, why is that? Well, the polls are beginning to show that almost as important as the state of the US economy, and thus inflation, and thus the Strait of Hormuz problem, we'll come back to all of that in a minute, equally important, or in rising importance to US voters, and it shouldn't be any surprise to our viewers here, is the corruption of the Trump family and the threats to democracy that they represent. The war that the president waged against the Supreme Court justices he didn't like, the war he waged against the Federal Reserve chairman whom he didn't like, the fear among US voters that Donald Trump has become fascist, has become a threat to democracy. That's becoming almost as important a voter issue. And it's as true of Republicans as Democrats. Yes, Democrats in some parts of the country are making it clearer on the street, but this issue is rising, and that favors Vance's succession. Why? Vance is now in a position where he, like Rubio, calculates that war must be good for his constituency. Vance must hold on to the MAGA constituency that Trump plays to in every tweet he issues, right? That's where Vance must maintain his support. And they equally, all of them, the president, Vance, and Rubio, all must try to preserve as much of the Republican Party vote in November as they can. But Vance doesn't need and doesn't want any kind of defeat or any kind of prolonged oil stoppage, either at the Strait of Hormuz or at the Bab el-Mandab entrance to the Red Sea. What Vance wants is a stop-go war against Iran. Not a loss, not a defeat, and not a withdrawal. Stop, go, which would preserve a lower level inflation, will not threaten the level of casualties we've spoken of before in US bases, but would stop and start and conserve ammunition, essentially, but not abandon war. War's good for Rubio, war's good for Vance. Now, the Democrats, and this is also interesting, have now reached in US polling of voter favor for Democratic candidate versus Republican candidate on November the 3rd. It's 50% now favor the Democratic candidate. Only 40% the Republicans. Now, that's a general poll, but the spread between the two parties has never been larger since Trump took over. Second, independent voters, people who identify as independents among our audience in the US electorate, independents are now swinging against Trump, against MAGA, and more towards the Democrats. There are fewer and fewer undecideds. That doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be a major landslide against the Republicans in Congress. No, it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily turn into massive Democratic control of the Senate or the House. But what it does point out is that this switch is not because of war. There is almost no, when I'm looking down at my polls, and pardon me for looking away from the camera, but when the pollsters ask, what do you think is the most important issue facing the United States? War in the Europe, war against Russia, war on the Ukraine battlefield doesn't get a mention. War against Iran, war against the Arabs of Palestine and Gaza don't get a mention. Yes, the economy, jobs, inflation, tax, education, healthcare, all of those things are important to US voters. There's no news for people viewing, but war is not making itself present as a vote issue in this election. Now, the other point I need to make from these new surprising poll results is the Democrats are as committed to killing Iran, killing Gaza, killing Russia, killing China, and killing Cuba. The Democrats don't represent an anti-war opposition. We are the anti-war opposition. That's the podcast audience, your audience, Nima. People who are watching us, we are the anti-war opposition, but we're not a party, and we're tiny. Let's admit it. We're a tiny voice in a much, much bigger podcast world. So these are the surprises on the US side, and they favor exactly the kind of war that we see Trump trying to portray crudely in the tweets that Stephen Miller, the ambitious deputy national assistant deputy chief of staff of the White House, composes and controls. Stop, start, threats to hit Iran, threats to provide new missile defenses for the Ukraine, then stopping, withdrawing the threats, proposing negotiations. Stop and start at Trump's crude way of speaking of a strategy that is now the favored route to the White House in 2028 of Rubio and Vance. Now, if you accept this structure, and we could argue about it, and all viewers from the United States will have different views from wherever you happen to be located. But the point I want to try to make is that some of this is surprising if you take the view that you are fighting wars against this United States, and you have to ask yourself, on our battlefield, the battlefield in Europe, the battlefield for Russians in the Ukraine, the battlefield for Iranians inside Iran and on Iran's borders. If you look at these US political surprises, you must ask, how are we fighting our war in such a way to deter and penalize Americans for doing this to us, for continuing the war? Now, I'll come back quickly to the Russian polls, because I think we can argue that President Putin's policies do not attack US vulnerabilities in such a way as to make US escalation through Ukraine on the Ukrainian battlefield and now on the Russian battlefield more painful for Russians. What is not happening is that Putin's war strategy does not attack US motivations to keep the war going and escalate. Let me quickly, and then stop me any minute you want to ask questions, Nima, here. Let me quickly go to the latest poll conducted by the Levada Center in Moscow in the last days of July and published, what are we today? 3 days ago, okay? What we find here, and I'm looking down at the papers, is that there's a relatively high level, roughly half of all Russians are now maintaining a pretty close watch on what's happening in the war. But that hasn't changed in the last 4 months. What we find, what the polls are showing, is that a large majority, more than 2/3 of Russians, support the Russian armed forces as they move westward along the front against Ukrainian forces. There's no doubt, there's no loss of confidence in the Russian armed forces. There is a declining confidence, though at a high level, for the performance of the president, the performance of the State Duma or members of parliament, the performance of regional governors. Okay? In addition to 2/3 of support for the Russian armed forces, everybody is aware of the attacks, the Ukrainian drone attacks, especially on the Wildberry warehouses, at the refinery, the effect on gasoline supplies, and so forth. Okay? Now, there is a sharp division between the attitudes of Russian men versus Russian women. More men want to escalate against the Ukraine than women do. Women want more attention to peace negotiations than men. That's one very important element. Older Russians are more in favor of escalation against the Ukraine in reaction to the current high level of drone raids against Russia and the impact they're having. Let's remember, they are killing people. More than a dozen people killed in the last 48 hours in the attack on Nizhny-Kamsk in Tatarstan, east of Moscow. Wealthier Russians and residents of Moscow, I'm looking down at the polls, are also in favor of escalation. Poorer Russians, Russians who live in the regions, those are the regions which supply the young men who are fighting and are suffering casualties on the front. Poorer Russians, rural Russians, Russians in the regions are less in favor of escalation. And the reason is they very well understand that it's their lives and their blood and their injuries which are at stake. Muscovites, the wealthier and the higher educated Russians, are in favor of escalation. Now, what do we see in the way in which the Russian side is fighting this war? You've got all the military experts you need. You don't need me to summarize. But military experts, for some reason in the United States, know next to nothing about the way White Houses work, and they know next to nothing about the way in which the Russian Kremlin works, the Security Council works. So we have a sort of surplus of military experts on podcasting, and a complete lack of political experts who understand from politicians' point of view how to fight a war when the polls show what is vulnerable on the other side and what costs we on one side or the other are paying. So the surprise on the Russian side internally is that the Ukrainian drone attacks are attacking that part of the Russian population most in favor of escalation. You could say, one way of putting it is the Ukrainian escalation, US guided, US planned, British planned, NATO supported. Let's not get into any further discussion about how involved the Trump administration is in this escalation. It's a combined effort. The fact of the matter is that that is carefully calculated at the support for the middle class support, the Muscovite support, the well-educated Russian support. They want to see more escalation. Russian women, the poorer Russians, do not. President Putin is trying to divide and accommodate both lines. He is trying to say things which are contradictory. He's trying to hold women's votes and men's votes at the same time. That there is a loss of confidence, not in the Russian army, not in the Russian armed forces strategy and operations, but a loss of confidence in the political direction. Now, this is the first point. The second point about the Russian polls and what we can learn from them, as if we were politicians who have to go to election, Russian election, September 18 to 20. We are going to election more quickly than US voters are going to election. So when we see war fighting in terms of domestic politics, and when we see costs of war as potential political losses, we see the current Putin strategy rather differently. We can come back to that. You'll ask me some more questions, but let me quickly point out 2 or 3 things that are very surprising that our podcast audience is not properly informed about. Paul Craig Robertson, you discussed it a little earlier today. The Mecca Pact, that's the pact between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. Before we come to the Mecca Pact, I'd like to talk about the Galani Pact with the Russian government. The current president of Syria is Al-Shara Galani. Those are his 2 names. He's the current president. We all know how he achieved it. We know that he defeated and drove out the Assad family, which had to flee to Russia. What Galani has just done, with Russian agreement, has to frame a new agreement that's been under negotiation for months now, in which Galani's regime will take over control of the Khmeimim air base, which has been the Russian air base in Syria since 2015, and the Tartus naval base, which has been the principal base for Russia in the Mediterranean. Syrian control will now close the perimeter of those bases to any efforts by Syrians, Alawis, Christians, others being persecuted and subject to pogroms inside Syria. Russia will no longer defend them or offer the bases as refuge. Instead, Syrian army, that's Galani's army, will control the bases and will allow, by agreement now with the Russian side, for Russia to use the Khmeimim air base for flights incoming and on their way to Africa, particularly Libya, and Tartus as a naval port. Tartus, the Russian naval fleet deployment in the Mediterranean is now minuscule, but Russia has preserved these bases on condition that Galani turns those bases into Syrian controlled operations. That's part of a scheme which was developed, is being developed, discussed and negotiated with Galani in the last few days by Jonathan Powell, the security advisor of the British government, and by MI6. So what we see is a surprise that compounds the defeat of the Russian side and the Iranian side in Iran at the end of 2024. What we see is a combination of US influence on Galani and MI6 influence on Galani to allow Russia a minimum use of these bases without serious control, subject to sudden reversals. The security situation for the Russians inside those bases is now almost entirely dependent on Galani and on a piece of paper. Russia has never been so weak in its position in Syria as now. All right. Second, by all means, you have an MI6 agent in the portfolio of this podcast. Alistair Crook was an MI6 agent. He's been honored with a CMG, a very high honor for his work for MI6. Let him explain what MI6's current role in persuading Galani to allow Russia this limited base area, and at the same time, the reduction of Russian ability to deter Galani from assembling forces against northern Lebanon for attack on Hezbollah arms stocks and Hezbollah positions in northern Lebanon. All of that indicates a serious loss of Russian influence in Syria and in the cockpit of the future of Syria, Lebanon, and southern Turkey. Let's come now quickly to the surprise, which also excludes Russia almost totally. That's the Mecca Pact. The pact signed in Mecca a few days ago by Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey. This is not only an imitation Article 5 of NATO, not only a combination of states that agree that if one is attacked, the other all are under threat and will aid each other. This is a combination of states, particularly Saudi money and Turkish strategy and Pakistan mercenaries, Pakistan cannon fodder, and the threat of Pakistan nuclear weapons. This is a combination against the two principal enemies of Saudi Arabia and the United States and Israel in the Middle East region now. The first enemy is Iran, and the second enemy is Iraq. Saudi Arabia must, for internal reasons and for historical reasons, must make sure not only that Iran is neutralized as an enemy, but Iraq. So, yes, Saddam Hussein is gone. Yes, Iraq is in no position to threaten Saudi Arabia as it did when Saddam was in power. Yes, the US facilitated the destruction of Iraq, but this pact enables a combination of factors. First, Saudi permanent war against Iran and Iraq. Second, Turkey is now building. It's now just bought 15%. I'm grateful to a Greek colleague for pointing this out. 15% of one of the major Kurdish, northern Iraq Kurdish oil fields. It's bought equity now in oil production in Iraqi Kurdistan. If you look at the base, the economic base of Turkey's expansion into Iraq, you see that this new pact, combined with Turkey's oil ambitions and its anti-Kurdish ambitions in Iraq, and its further ambitions, commercial ambitions along the Mediterranean coast of Syria. You see this pact as enabling Turkey to expand principally towards Iraq and secondarily towards Iran. And that's why we see a certain amount flashback and criticism from Iran that this is a pact that will not generate the kind of security that these countries thought they would get from the United States. Rather, it is a reinforcement of the security that the US and Israel have provided. But maybe I need to stop there. The last point I need to emphasize again, the Mecca Pact shows definitively that Turkey can act independently and in a way that's hostile to Russian interest in the Middle East. There's no more prospect of Sergei Lavrov's framework for Persian Gulf security. This supersedes and eliminates it. Second, Russia is now dependent on Turkey. Russia has failed. The Kirill Dmitriev years of trying to court Saudi Arabia have failed. Russia is now facing the fact that this pact, the combination of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey, aim at two significant strategic allies of Russia, Iran and India. Okay, so a pact is composed, supported by Qatar, maybe involving other Arab states like Egypt, with Saudi money, with US support and Israeli support, and it has totally cancelled Russian strategy in the Middle East and threatening not only Iran now, but India.